Hi, everyone. Hello, welcome to the Labs 2023 Call for Ideas webinar. We are very happy to have such a large and truly global turnout today. Thank you so much for your interest in the lab. Before we start, here are a few reminders. This webinar is being live streamed on YouTube and will be available on demand as soon as it's over. We will send the video link and the slides we are showing today to you all. Today, we'll walk you through the 2023 Labs Call for Ideas, open until December 26. You'll learn about the lab process and the selection criteria. We'll detail our priority areas and regions for 2023, and then discuss key questions from the application form. If you have questions, type them on the Q&A feature on Zoom, not the chat, but the Q&A. You'll find the icon on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question anytime, and we will answer them after the presentation. Our goal today is to answer all questions, but given the limited time, we'll follow up via email for anything we can get to today. So we encourage you to continue the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ben Brochette, Associate Director at Climate Policy Initiative and the head of the Labs Global Program. Hello, Ben. Take it away.
Thanks, Julio. And hello, everyone. Here we go again. The kickoff of another lab cycle. It's always a really exciting time for our team and hopefully for many of you on the line to be kicking off a new cycle. It's really encouraging to see the growing attention the lab is getting. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We really look forward to helping you improve and target your submissions, which will ultimately help to ensure this cycle is as impactful as possible and hopefully make all of our lives easier. We're really hoping to have an open and hopefully really useful conversation with you all today. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Climate Policy Initiative or CPI, the lab is one of our programs and CPI serves as the secretariat. CPI's mission is to help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive growth while addressing climate change. We're a global institution with offices in Brazil, India, Indonesia, the UK, and the US, and other staff and consultants spread all around the world. Thanks again for being here and your interest. So let's go ahead and get started with today's agenda. So we'll kick things off by explaining how the lab works to develop climate finance instruments from concept to operations. Then my colleague Rosalie Bird will walk you through what the lab is looking for 2023, detailing our regional programs and thematic streams for the upcoming cycle. And after that, two of my other CPI colleagues, Morgan Richmond and Kyle Blocher, will go through the application process and selection criteria with examples from past successful submissions. Following the presentations, we'll invite you all to ask questions. And you can go ahead and start typing your questions into the Q&A box at any point during the webinar, and we'll address them after the presentation. So with that, let me just start by introducing you to the lab program. So in the next slide, scaling up and mainstreaming climate investing is really going to be a crucial step on the pathway to 1.5 degrees, just to frame this discussion in broad terms, right? The latest numbers from CPI's Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which you can see now on your screen, show that global climate finance flows have almost doubled in the last decade. Reaching around $660 billion in 2020. This was primarily driven by rapid growth in the renewable energy and transport sectors. While we don't have the final numbers yet, based on some initial estimates, we definitely see this growth trend continuing with estimates that climate finance flows may reach $850 billion annually in 2021 and 2022. That's great news, but however, it's only half the story. These incremental increases in climate investment fall significantly short of what it will take for a successful low-carbon, climate-resilient economic transition. We need at least 4.3 trillion in annual finance flows through 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And despite the seemingly dramatic scale of this funding gap, it represents less than 5% of global GDP. And this increase in finance would, of course, not be based solely on new additional sources of finance, but the continuation of flows that are already existing. But overall, aligning finance with a 1.5 degree path would, of course, demand the cutting of financing for high emissions activities and continuing to scale the allocation of resources to new climate finance projects around the world. So a path that we're on, but certainly a monumental task ahead. The lab was launched in 2014 as a coalition of public, development finance, and private investors to play a key role in bridging this climate investment gap by identifying the best ideas to unlock emerging economy climate investment, building those ideas into bankable financial instruments, and supporting their pathway to market. So far, we've launched 62 instruments that have included various funds, facilities, guarantees, bonds, insurance and credit products, and more. Very wide, diverse array of financial instruments and innovations, but they all share this common vision to leverage the very limited public or concessional capital when blended properly to unlock private investment at scale. Our theory of change revolves around three key pillars. Firstly, the importance of collaboration between the public and private sectors, our approach of openly sourcing concepts for transformative financial instruments from the market, from innovators around the world, many of you on the line today, surely, and of course, a powerful network of financiers and policymakers that have the capacity to move solutions selected by and developed through the lab into action quickly. The lab relies on our network of more than 70 governments, development banks, philanthropies, and private investors who actively contribute to the development of each year's selected ideas. Lab members are high-level leaders from the public and private sectors who contribute expertise, political capital, and in some cases, financial capital as well to the selected instruments. Lab members drive the lab's activities, including the selection, development, and endorsement of the instruments. So far, the lab programs have mobilized over $3.5 billion with finance from our membership, unlocking significant co-investment, with close to 50% of the $3.5 billion mobilized coming from commercial banks and institutional investors, the very sources of capital that we desperately need to see in emerging market climate projects. So just to go through how it works and illustrate the lab process in a bit more detail, you'll have some examples of how this has worked in some case studies later. But just broadly, first off, we have an annual open call for innovative investment solutions that has brought in hundreds of ideas over the years from a diverse group of proponents. We're currently at this stage. As most of you who are probably aware, the call for ideas is open until December 26th of this year. Successful proponents in the past have included startups, entrepreneurs, boutique fund managers, and large institutions from the public and private sectors, academic institutions, as well as various NGOs. The lab's call for ideas is really open to all innovators, and I think over the last 8 years that we've been running the program, we've really worked hard to adapt and sort of nuance the support that the lab is able to provide for different types of proponent institutions. Ultimately, we're looking for strong teams with great track records that have specific market knowledge and the commitment and the ability to drive one of these concepts from idea into action. But that can really include institutions across a very wide spectrum. So once the call for ideas concludes in December, CPI then screens submissions against an established set of criteria to determine eligibility. And then we refine the most promising ideas through remote screening and in-person review with the full lab network. So there's an initial screening for lab eligibility that takes place first. Then the most promising ideas are sent for voting and further refinement through virtual and ultimately an in-person selection meeting this year at the global level. Then at the development stage, once each cohort is admitted in, the Secretariat, lab members, and working groups comprised of other experts partner with the selected ideas over several months to develop these concepts into bankable financial solutions. Once the analytical phase is concluded, lab members vote to endorse the final instruments, which signals their readiness to move into the market and the lab's full support. The focus then moves into what we call our implementation support or continued support phase, which my colleague Carla will talk more about. This is the go-to-market oriented phase of the lab and is focused on fundraising to launch pilots, which support with support from the lab's network. And this lasts for an additional year of targeted support, analysis, and investor matchmaking, and is really intended to help ensure endorsed instruments get off the ground quickly and efficiently. And this is our process. So there's a lot more information on our website, including detailed guidelines and an FAQ that you can find there. And we'll also be providing some additional details later in the webinar. And I think Julia is posting some of those links to some of the process-oriented documents now. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rose Liepert, Senior Program Associate with the lab, to introduce the 2023 Lab Call for Ideas and give you an overview of what the lab is looking for this year. Over to you, Ro.
Great, thanks, Ben. So the lab for its 2023 cycle is looking for 6 climate finance ideas from 3 regional programs, 2 thematic streams, and including 1 open idea. This year, the lab's also introducing a gender equality stream and expanding its Africa program to include East Africa, both really exciting new moves that we're making. But let's go one by one and explain some of the regional programs, and then we'll get into the thematic streams as well. So first, the lab will select 1 idea for each regional program. The lab's regional programs in Brazil and India have developed over 20 instruments, which you can see here on the screen, since the lab first introduced regional programs in 2016. These regional programs leverage national networks of highly capable financiers and implementers with deep knowledge of these local markets. And the idea is that these regional programs will really allow the lab to focus on local contexts and priorities, addressing country-specific investment needs and barriers. To qualify for either of these regional programs, your idea should primarily target one of these markets. And then we have the Africa program, right, which is a bit different because it does encompass various countries instead of just one country for each for the Brazil and India program. In 2023, we're also expanding the Africa program, right? The Africa Regional Program. This Africa Regional Program was created in 2020 and focused just on Southern African countries, all 16 Southern African Development Community members. But after 3 cycles and developing 3 instruments, the lab's now looking for ideas that also target countries that are part of the East African community, totaling 21 countries in total. The selected ideas will necessarily target one or a group of the countries listed on the screen here. Right, so for the thematic streams, this is the second year of the lab's adaptation specific stream. The lab selected and developed adaptation instruments in the past as part of a broader lab program, but now this specific stream is meant to put adaptation in the spotlight for climate finance innovators. Submissions should focus on climate-stressed regions in developing countries. They should identify how the proposed financing approach would address specific physical climate risks and overcome barriers to mobilizing finance for climate adaptation. Submissions should also include a plan to phase down public financial support, but at the same time, they should offer attractive risk-adjusted returns to investors in order to scale private investment. Lastly, ideas should demonstrate the potential to avoid maladaptation, support improved livelihoods, and strengthen the broader financial ecosystem in the implementation countries. The US Department of State is supporting this lab's adaptation stream. Now for a novelty, we're really excited about this new stream, gender equality stream, new for the 2023 lab cycle and with support from FinDev Canada. The lab's seeking proposals for financial solutions that have both the advancement of gender equality and addressing climate change mitigation or adaptation as core objectives. Ideas must directly impact specific outcomes for gender equality and women empowerment. This could include, but certainly isn't limited to, financial instruments that facilitate access to finance for women entrepreneurs, producers, or women-led SMEs delivering climate solutions, that promote diverse leadership and inclusive employment practices and climate mitigation and adaptation investments, promote the design and uptake of goods and services targeted to the needs and disproportionate climate risks faced by women, such as insurance tools, target women as end users, consumers, and borrowers, for example, in climate resilient infrastructure investments, and are founded on strong gender analysis and use this to really identify a project pipeline and mainstream gender equality into investment processes. So lastly, alongside the 5 ideas that will be developed in the Lab's 2023 specific sectoral or regional programs, the lab will also select one climate finance idea that targets any climate relevant sector in any developing country, right? Submissions to this open stream should explain clearly why the target sector and geography identified should be priorities for climate finance mobilization. And ideas could cover a variety of sectors, including, but not limited to some of these on the screen: nature-based solutions, renewable energy, food systems, or land use. So for that, I'll turn it over now to my colleagues, Morgan Richmond and Kyle Blocher, who will walk us through some of the details in the application process. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rosalie. So yes, Kyle and I will spend a few minutes here describing what makes an application to the lab successful, with a handful of illustrative examples from past applications, and then guidance on a number of key questions in the Call for Ideas questionnaire. So first, to give a sense of how ideas are assessed, lab ideas are selected based on a set of criteria. On actionability first, we look for ideas that demonstrate involvement of entities able to implement the idea with relevant expertise, a clear pathway to implementation, including a defined timeframe, key activities, and project milestones, and identification of potential risks to implementation and articulated strategies for dealing with them. This last element we'll discuss further in a few slides with an example question from the questionnaire. Next, for catalytic potential, which we think about in the lab context as the ability of the idea to mobilize private sources of climate finance, ideas should demonstrate the potential to scale up private investment in the target market and the ability or potential to replicate in other market contexts. Third, in innovation, successful lab ideas will demonstrate how the idea addresses barriers to climate finance that either have not yet been addressed or will be addressed more effectively than existing approaches in the market through the idea. In essence, here we're looking for submissions that clearly articulate how the idea submitted is a value add as compared to other efforts in the space. And then regarding financial sustainability, high quality lab ideas will have a clear strategy for phasing out public and philanthropic financial support over time and for achieving market viability on commercial terms, even if that runway is relatively long in certain cases. They should also identify challenges and risks in achieving these objectives and strategies for managing them. Alongside the 4 criteria on the prior slide, we also evaluate whether the idea is a good fit for the lab process. We look for ideas where the lab has a significant likely value add to the success of the instrument and of the proponent team in implementing the idea, where the capabilities of the lab team and network complement the proposing team's capabilities and needs, and where the team that's proposing the idea has sufficient time available and a workable governance structure to participate in the lab process. The box on the right here captures the lab's core activities and value offerings for reference. This same list is included in the questionnaire to help us understand where the proponent team sees the most significant value adds of the lab. Kyle will speak a bit more on how we think about this criteria when he walks through a few specific questions from the questionnaire in a few minutes. So to illustrate the evaluation of ideas submitted in practice, I'll share 2 examples of past lab instruments that were selected, successfully went through the lab process, and were endorsed. And I'll highlight how in the selection phase these ideas stood out. So first, for cooling as a service, this was an idea that was proposed in the 2019 cycle of the lab by the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, and then Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, now called the Clean Cooling Collaborative. This instrument is a pay-per-service model to decrease energy consumption and HFC emissions from cooling systems by making more efficient cooling technologies more accessible to customers. Cooling as a service stood out as highly actionable, with demonstrable team experience, an executed MOU with a local partner already completed in a proposed pilot country, and evidence in the submission that it did not rely on new legislation. It stood out as highly catalytic, with significant potential for scale, given cited projections in the submission that the global AC market will triple by 2050, and a clear case for private investment. It stood out as innovative, as it applied the pay-per-service model to a new market, cooling, and articulated how it improved on existing financing approaches for clean cooling. And then finally, it stood out as having high potential for financial sustainability, as it was clear how it would become a fully commercial solution and that it would not rely long-term on grant finance. So that's example one. And then example two is the Restoration Insurance Service Company, or RISCO, which was proposed in the same cycle as Cooling as a Service 2019 by Conservation International. RISCO is a social enterprise that invests in mangrove conservation and restoration in areas with high coastal value or high value coastal assets, protecting blue carbon, and reducing flooding and property damage risk. RISCO, like CAS, stood out as highly actionable, with a team with a proven track record in the space, a submission that had clearly articulated milestones towards implementation, and again, evidence that it would not rely on new legislation. It stood out as highly catalytic, with the concept already underway for scaling up operations and early estimates of completed of market size and impact. It stood out as innovative, as the submission demonstrated that it was a novel approach to pricing the benefits of mangrove restoration, and with a potential for climate impact that improved on existing solutions. And finally, the potential for financial sustainability was evident, with barriers to commercial viability clearly identified, and strategies to overcome them articulated, and the plan for use of grant capital delineated and limited. I'll also note for both Cooling as a Service and RISCO that both of these ideas in their submissions clearly articulated how the lab process could bring value to their efforts to implement. And it was clear that the teams proposing the ideas had sufficient capacity to engage as part of the lab process. So with that, I will pass it over to Kyle, who will walk through a specific guidance on a number of the key questions in the questionnaire.
Great, thanks, Morgan. So we'll now provide maybe a bit more context on just a few of the points that Morgan made by zooming in on the lab application itself. So we're going to talk through 3 examples of key application questions, along with some sample responses from submissions that were ultimately selected. So beyond assessing how actionable, catalytic, financially sustainable, and innovative your idea is, we'll also be looking to ensure that the lab is really well suited to support you in developing your idea. For example, the lab does not provide direct funding for selected instruments, so only applicants seeking technical assistance will be considered. To gauge whether the lab's a good fit for you, the application asks for your objectives in applying to the lab, and how the lab process can help you achieve your goals. Prior to answering this question, we recommend that you review the lab's impact report on our website. Included there, you'll find specific examples of how the lab has supported instruments in the past. Once you've had a look at the impact report, you should frame your response in the context of how the lab's technical assistance offerings can help you develop your idea. Note the highlighted text in the sample response at the bottom of the screen clearly outlines how the lab can assist by stress testing the concept and assessing risks to implementation. When reviewing your responses, we'll also want to ensure that the lab's core competencies and value offerings are well suited to meet your needs. Note that the sample response at the bottom of the slide references 2 key areas of the lab's value proposition: blended finance expertise and knowledge of impact KPIs. Next, to make sure that you are well equipped to fully engage throughout the course of the lab process, and more importantly, to assess whether you're willing and able to implement your idea following the conclusion of the lab process, we'll ask what resources you plan to commit to developing your idea. One of the first things we'll look for is internal buy-in from high-level staff, such as department heads or managing partners, as highlighted in the example at the bottom of the slide. Demonstrating high-level buy-in will help alleviate concerns that organizational priorities may shift away from instrument development. We'll also want to see that developing your idea into an actionable financial instrument is a primary responsibility for at least one core team member. The lab process is highly collaborative, so it's crucial that we have a reliable point of contact that will prioritize the lab process and is empowered to make key instrument design decisions. Finally, we'll need to see that you're committed to developing your idea in the long term. The core lab process lasts only 7 months, far shorter than the time it takes to fully develop and launch a new financial instrument. We'll need to see that you're willing and able to dedicate sufficient long-term resources to implement your idea after the core lab cycle concludes. Implementation is a full-time job that requires significant long-term resources, such as a fully dedicated team, as described in the sample response at the bottom of the screen. Finally, we'll look to gauge the extent to which you've thought through the risks to implementing your idea and the strategies you'll employ to address those risks. When answering this question, it's important to be transparent with us. The example of responses highlighted below are genuinely challenging risks to overcome. All instruments face material challenges like currency risk or unexpected economic shocks, so it's important to address those really tough challenges directly rather than minimizing or trying to avoid them. Next, you'll want to identify mitigation strategies which are uniquely tailored to address the risks that you outlined. It's helpful to have diversified risk mitigation strategy, like the sample response, which describes 2 separate strategies used in tandem to address currency risk. Strong submissions will also demonstrate which solutions which indicate differentiation from the market. For example, this sample response at the bottom of the slide highlights how the applicant planned to use proprietary data and modeling tools to respond to changing market dynamics. And with that, I'll now pass it back to Ben to kick off the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and Morgan as well, and Rosalie for that really useful bit of information. So yeah, at this point, we've already seen a bunch of questions coming through, but please feel free to go ahead and continue typing those questions into the Q&A. Also, please feel free to review our FAQ document and also the specific FAQ doc for the gender equality stream, which is new this year. We're going to be posting those links into the chat box now, I think. So yeah, just give us maybe 1 minute to sort through a couple of the questions, and I think we can go ahead and get started. First of all, I guess I can just start out by hopefully addressing a number of the questions that came in, which are around geography. So this is obviously a key question each year because we have these regional focus areas on some of the larger economies and places where the lab has historically had a really large concentration of submissions. So this year, that's Brazil, India, and Southern and East Africa. Within those, got a couple of questions around, hey, we have an instrument or an idea that targets some Southern African economies, some East African. Which should I select? Feel free to select either of those. Just noting that if your idea is broadly applicable, that's fine. Absolutely fine. We are looking for ideas that tend to have a strong market connection, right? So if that's in one country, great. If it's in multiple countries, also completely fine. If you look at the lab portfolio, we've had a number of sort of single country ideas within our regional programs, like Southern Africa. Obviously for India or Brazil, that's a little bit more straightforward because it's one economy and those are very large economies. If your operations are outside of those, but the primary market is either India or Brazil, that's fine too. Again, many of the lab ideas have had application or have ultimately had operations outside of the initial target country or region, but we definitely want to see from an actionability standpoint the ability of the team to implement within a given initial target market. Then the second set of questions, which I think were a number of which came through, we're basically, hey, I have an idea that's not in these regions. It's focused on West Africa or other economies in Latin America, or Bangladesh or some other place. Absolutely relevant. We are certainly not limited to the regional programs. That's just one aspect of what the lab does. This is why we have the thematic windows that are open to all to all emerging economies. So those could certainly be in any of those regions. So the gender thematic stream, gender and climate, the adaptation stream, and then the general wildcard stream, which is intended to be basically a flexible slot for submissions that don't fall into the regional and the thematic categories. So hopefully that should answer some of those initial questions. There was also a number of questions coming through about resubmitting. So folks that may have submitted to the lab before, maybe Morgan, if you want to take that one, or Kyle, whoever wants to jump in.
Sure. In terms of resubmitting, I will say to start that many ideas that have successfully gone through the lab process that eventually were selected applied multiple years before they were selected. So flag that maybe as a starting point. Yes, I think please do think about resubmitting. Please feel free to reach out directly to the team, or we can coordinate on that with you afterwards on feedback. We're always happy to give feedback to submitted ideas post submission from from a prior year regarding sort of evaluation against the key criteria, et cetera. So I would say yes, and in particular, I recommend thinking about how the specific streams, both regional and sectoral, fit with the idea that you submitted. That would be my main guidance. I'm happy to take one other question, Ben, if you'd like, which is a couple of different questions coming in about sort of what is an instrument, how do we think about a financial instrument in the context of the lab? Good question, and one we get a lot. I'm happy to start and answer, and others can jump in. I would say how we think about it is we're looking for tools, structures, and approaches to investment, which have the potential to mobilize private capital. Essentially, we're looking for instruments with envisioned cash flows, and that's something we look for in applications. Is what is the specific cash flow envisioned? They can be debt and equity funds, they can be bonds, insurance products, guarantees, blended financial instruments. The two paper service model and for cooling, and Risco with mangrove restoration, which is a whole sort of blend of financial instruments or financial tools maybe apply. So that's sort of a high level answer. One piece of sort of a suggestion I would provide for folks is to go look through the 62 ideas that are all up on the lab website, because I think that gives maybe the best picture that anything can of the kinds of ideas that are successful and come through the lab. And so you can see there, okay, here's what I'm envisioning applying with. Does this sort of match the scale and scope and structure of the ideas that have been coming through the process? Each instrument has an instrument mechanics diagram where you can see the envisioned sources of cash flows and of technical assistance, et cetera, sort of the vision for the instrument. And my suggestion is to look at those and see if what you're envisioning could eventually sort of match with the scope and structure of the instruments, not in precise terms, but in concept. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Super helpful. Just, yeah, maybe on the next one, Rosalie, wondering if you could maybe speak to our process of investor connections through our network. I know we had a couple of questions about that, sort of how that process takes place.
Sure. Just to note that we did send the link to a list of all past developed instruments by the lab. So as Morgan had mentioned, definitely check it out. I think it'll give a good idea of what has actually gone through with the lab and what we're looking for. But as for funding and connections with funders, just to be clear and transparent at the onset before you even submit an application, we do not provide direct funding to instruments. So if that is something that maybe you are more looking for or more interested in, I would probably suggest thinking twice about submitting an application, because it is quite time intensive, because those ideas will not really get the full value of what the lab has to offer, if that's what you're looking for. That being said, we do help these idea proponents, as we call them, to develop the idea and to really make them strong instruments that we can then sell to investors or to other possible funders. And those include possibly some of the members that are part of our network. So the entire analytical development process is really to be able to say, okay, we spent 6-7 months working on these instruments to make sure that they're in top shape and that they answer a lot of the questions and they are that investors may have, and to then present them to investors. But it's that introduction to investors and so forth also is something that happens at the end of the process, once we help in the actual analytical development process together with you, the proponents. So just to be clear. I think that I'm going through questions, if there's any other ones that'd be interesting to answer.
Maybe just one thing. We had a couple of questions on equity stakes. So the lab does not, the CPI and the lab does not take an equity stake in any of the ideas or the proponent companies. We are a not-for-profit institution that has a neutral role as secretariat to support the development of these ideas. All investment decisions are made bilaterally through institutions either within or outside of the lab network and the proponents. Often we will support the proposals to whether it's donor programs or concessional finance or prize programs or other cash-based accelerators following the lab process, which has been highly successful in raising initial startup capital for the ideas. But all of that takes place on a case-by-case basis. So just noting that for others, we're a bit different from like a commercial accelerator program that's focused on building and launching startups, which often in many cases takes an equity stake in exchange for some seed capital. So maybe Kyle, not sure if you can jump in there. Yeah, we're seeing a few questions on sort of the stage and financial acumen necessary and what we're looking for in terms of level of development and team to be successful in this process. I know you've done a lot of work on that recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So one question on support for a pilot stage instrument. So we don't necessarily discriminate on stage of development, but with that being said, on that later stage of development, we're going to be looking to ensure that our instrument development process is compatible with what you're looking for. So it's really kind of up to you to decide whether or not the lab process can help you out and really take your idea to the next level, and can benefit from kind of further instrument design and stress testing. But if your idea is the pilot stage and it's really kind of a fully set instrument that's just looking for kind of investor connections and no further instrument development, it may be a bit too late stage to benefit from our full program. Another question that we got was about the level of financial knowledge expected to demonstrate. So again, I mean that's kind of a great area in which the lab can help out. We are experts in blended finance, so that's something that we can really come in and help provide a complementary skill set if that's something that you don't have experience in. With that being said, some level of financial knowledge and experience is going to be required because you're ultimately the ones who are going to need to be implementing the idea upon completion of the lab. So we can help develop your idea, but we're not going to be there to really be doing the heavy lifting of implementing the instrument. So it would be great if you could demonstrate the high level or financial expertise and knowledge to whatever degree you can. Finally, there was one more question which was interesting on potential red flags that we'll be looking for when screening. So you can kind of look at the flip side of a lot of the examples that I ran through in the presentation. So for one, if you're only looking for funding, or as alluded to, if you could not benefit from instrument design and that kind of real technical analytical assistance that we provide, then that's probably not going to be a good fit for us. If you're not targeting a developing country, then we probably aren't going to be reviewing your application at length. And another key one in terms of our actionability criteria is we're going to be looking to make sure that your organization and the core team that's going to be working on the idea has autonomy to make key decisions. So it is, I mentioned it before, and I'll say it again, it's a really collaborative process. So it's important that we're able to work with you in a very open way and advance the ball. Because again, it is a really tight timeline at only 7 months. So hopefully that answered some of your questions.
Morgan, did you want to come in on the adaptation side?
Yeah, sure. There was a question, or maybe even multiple, about if you have an idea that addresses both climate mitigation and adaptation components, should you apply in the adaptation stream or in the open ideas stream? My suggestion is that within the adaptation stream, we're really looking for ideas that have a very specific approach to a set of physical climate risks, so that there's real identification of what those specific physical climate risks are. And that the idea has some sort of systemic thinking about how to overcome barriers to mobilizing finance, especially private finance, for climate adaptation. But I will say that, certainly many adaptation ideas have great mitigation co-benefits. And so if you have an adaptation idea that is, a mangrove restoration that also yields emissions benefits, or a renewables project, or a partially renewables focused project that has significant resilience outcomes, we're really happy to see those kinds of instruments and certainly acknowledge that these are not siloed sectors, mitigation and adaptation. So I would say, I know that's not a perfect answer, but I would say we're looking for ideas in the adaptation stream that are maybe primarily adaptation focused, and certainly where that is the core goal, but happy to look at ideas with both. And the other thing I'll say that I think is relevant, actually not just to the adaptation stream, but more broadly, is that it's not, the application process is not such that when you apply with your idea, if it's not evaluated to fit perfectly, it's out. It's more flexible than that. So if we get an idea that has both mitigation and adaptation outcomes within it, and determine that it's not a sufficient fit for the adaptation stream, the idea won't be just then booted. It would just then be evaluated within the open ideas stream. And I think that applies to the regional and other sectoral streams as well. So hopefully that provides some comfort that it's not, there's some flexibility and understanding that ideas can be evaluated in one stream or another, sort of at the discretion of the Secretariat and the members.
Thanks, Morgan. Maybe I'll just jump in quickly with a couple of points. I know there were a few questions around the ticket size, the maximum amount of funding or the minimum amount of funding that we're looking for. 2 points there. First of all, as I hope is clear, the lab is not a grant-making institution, nor are we concerned with funding projects. So if you have a project that is not a financial instrument or a financial solution, obviously a financial instrument needs projects as pipeline. But if you are simply looking for funding for an individual project, we are probably not the best avenue for you to go for that. Because as noted, the primary focus of this is twofold. One, very intense technical assistance over a long-term basis across all of the sort of sustainable finance accelerator programs. The lab is fairly unique in dedicating a massive amount of resources to acceleration services for our proponent teams that are admitted, and on the other hand, connection to a funder network within the blended finance space, spanning grants, development capital, and commercial capital. So that's the first point. The second point there, in terms of ticket size and scalability, catalytic potential is one of our key criteria. That is basically two things. It's the ability to measure the social and environmental impacts, the climate impacts of a given idea, as well as the ability of that idea to scale and draw in commercial capital. As we know, the majority of commercial institutions and private investors are looking for larger ticket sizes. So there is not a minimum, but I would say generally most ideas that are coming into the lab are targeting a final, whether it's a final close or an impact when at scale, in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. Some may be less, especially in the more challenging sectors. So, for adaptation, we may see those amounts a bit smaller, but they could be much larger in those spaces. Obviously, the runway to that can be long. Only a few ideas that have come into the lab process are looking for hundreds of millions of dollars out of the gate. Some of them have raised that. Many others are looking for smaller seed capital grant funding at the beginning. But eventually, when at scale, we want to see that impact being fairly broad. So if your idea is only targeting, say, a $5 or a $10 million project or series of projects, it might be best to take a look at your pipeline and the model and see if there might be opportunities to expand that impact a little bit more. So hopefully that is clear. I don't know if there are some others. So there were also some questions on the India category, what infrastructure refers to. I mean, this is quite broad in our understanding of it, and we sort of left it intentionally that way. So this can be in the energy space. We've done a lot in low carbon transit, whether that's micro or last mile transit, or larger transit infrastructure, resilient urban infrastructure, the built environment, the sort of agriculture climate nexus, if it's around productive use and infrastructure, is also eligible within the India program. It's a pretty broad understanding. Obviously, it needs to be a climate relevant sector and fit with all the other lab criteria. I'm just looking through, sort of trying to see some other broad trends here. Oh, questions around IP. Okay, this is something that's important. This was kind of tied in with the equity questions earlier, but this is an important thing to note. So for proponent IP, when you are submitting to the lab, if your proposal is successful, that will be viewed by the institutions in the lab network. So that is something that you need to be comfortable with, and not putting anything that is incredibly commercially sensitive in there that you would not be comfortable. Again, this is not published publicly or publicly available in any way, but given the lab's approach as an investor network, if that proposal makes it through the initial screening phase and goes on to the shortlist that is shared with the members will see that application that you're submitting. In terms of IP through the process, so one of the first things that CPI does when a proponent team is admitted is we sign a two-way NDA and an MOU, basically outlining the proponent role. CPI and the proponent teams work very, very closely, so there has to be that ability to share some degree of IP. We're very careful with ensuring that anything that is commercially sensitive is only shared with the working groups and external parties when there's bilateral agreement that is necessary. So it's something that we iterate on a team by team basis, but we have found that it's really important to have a close working relationship, given the fact that CPI, as a neutral nonprofit, our whole role is to help these ideas become successful and raise capital and have an impact in the market. But we're very careful to leave anything that's commercially sensitive out of the public facing documents. So yeah, that's something that often comes up on these. Great. So Kyle, did you want to jump in on the sort of types of support provided?
Sure. Yes, there's one question, which had, I guess, three embedded questions. One, addressing the types of financial support that organizations get. So we provide, to begin with, kind of financial instrument mechanics design. So a market analysis, as well as some financial modeling, and largely really developing the structure in detail to really litigate all of the cash flows and key stakeholders and the incentive structures related to all those stakeholders. So that's kind of at a very high level the types of financial assistance we provide. Again, I'll refer you to the lab's impact report. There are some kind of testimonials or case studies from past participants in the lab where they can explain kind of some of the benefit that they got. So refer you there. The role of the lab is not only to link with key donors and investors. We really do emphasize our focus on that financial and analytical support. But we do have a very robust network and absolutely want to provide as many useful connections with donors and investors as possible. So that is a key value proposition, but not the only value proposition of the lab. And finally, your question on whether the lab is supporting only new ideas. We support new financial instruments which have never been launched before. That would certainly be an innovative financial instrument. In addition to that, though, we are also looking for ideas which may have worked in one market or target geography or sector, which are being applied to a new market or sector. So a great example of that is the cooling as a service idea, which Morgan highlighted in the presentation, which took the kind of the pay-as-you-go solar model and applied it to the cooling sector. So that would be an example of the types of instruments which are particularly successful in the lab, is taking a proven model and applying it in a new way to a new context. So hopefully that answers your 3 questions.
I know there's a number of other questions, even as we're approaching the end of the hour. But just to say, this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. If you have additional questions, we're of course available to answer those as needed. And I'm not sure if we're going to add a pitch for this, but I believe we're also doing something new this year where we're kind of having open office hours at some point with some of our staff. If there are particular questions that may arise through the application process between now and the end of December. So we want to make sure that the submissions are the best quality, that you're not wasting your time. But yeah, if you're starting your application and there's some particular questions that come up, you should be able to contact our team and ask those. Again, we're limited in what we can provide. That's why this webinar is here. We can't preview applications or give particular steers, just to make sure that there's equality across the program to all applicants. But if there's particular questions, we can answer it after. There was one other one that I saw in here. Oh, I think we actually already answered that one. There were a few questions around AI and our ability to sort of support that. We have had several actually AI focused ideas in the past, as well as some that have relied on distributed ledgers and other Web3 technologies and emerging tech. That's fine. But again, just underscoring the fact that our network CPI skill set is not around the development of emerging technologies. We are not a tech-focused incubator. We are a financial innovation-focused incubator. So if there is an underlying technology that is sort of supporting a financial solution, then that could certainly be eligible. But ultimately, when you're targeting your submission, it's we would really encourage you to think about the network and the capacity and the capabilities that CPI can bring, and sort of making sure that that's something that you're particularly interested in. There was a question that just came through around the lab looks at new instruments or instruments working in one geography to see how to replicate in others. Would you consider a small instrument operating in multiple markets but looking to scale up? Absolutely. I think the key question there with an instrument that might already be in operation is ensuring that there's a key value add from a technical assistance standpoint. All lab submissions really need to sort of successful ones have to hit that well. So as Kyle noted earlier and Morgan went through as well, we're really looking for submissions that are not only looking for capital, but also can really benefit from the technical support from CPI and the lab network to build that up. But certainly if there's a product that's operating via a small pilot, but is looking to scale, that could be eligible. Great. Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. As mentioned before, this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. Please keep in touch. as you're developing your submissions. Really hoping that this was helpful, and that we've hopefully encouraged many of you to submit or to improve or shift your submissions in some way through this webinar. I think we are going to be launching a poll at the end. So it'd be great if you could just fill that out for our records. It's helpful. And yeah, with that in mind, thank you all so much for your time and attention.